Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the different shutter modes in your camera. We're not going to be talking about shutter speed yet because at this point in the series I still want the camera to be controlling the shutter speed for you. But we will be talking about the different shutter modes, the mechanical, single frame shot, anti-shock, electronic shutter, and kind of the difference between the two and some of the advantages and disadvantages between mechanical shutter and electronic shutter. Because I think it's important for you to understand what the camera is doing exactly and all of the different modes available, or sub-modes I would call them, available to you in the different shutter modes, so that when you go out you can be more creative and take more control of the camera without worrying about exposure quite just yet, okay? Because that's a whole nother can of worms. But in any case, there's really only 3 shutter modes in the camera, okay? There's a mechanical shutter, there's the anti-shock mechanical shutter, and then there's the fully electronic shutter, otherwise known as the silent mode. And that's really it in terms of the different shutter modes. And then there's subsets of that, like sequential high for continuous shooting, sequential low for slower continuous shooting. And then there's shutter delays, like the self-timers for 12 seconds, 2 seconds. And then there's the anti-shock delay, which is another type of delay in the camera for the shutter to reduce shock. So we'll talk about each one of those and maybe some applications for those as well. But let me show you. Let's talk first about the mechanical shutter, okay, and how that works exactly. Now, in the E-M10 Mark II, we have what they call a focal plane curtain shutter. Okay, so I have a little video here. I wanted to show you exactly how the mechanical shutter is working, okay? Because when you push the shutter button, you can feel it, right? You can feel it in the camera when you push the shutter button, that slight vibration, and we'll talk about anti-shock after that. But for the mechanical shutter, all that's happening is, okay, right now here's the camera, it's in live view, the sensor's exposed, but when you push the shutter button all the way down, take the picture, the camera turns off the sensor, closes the shutter, then turns the sensor back on, then opens the front curtain shutter, okay, for a certain amount of time. Maybe that's 1/60th of a second, 1/100th of a second, maybe it's 1 second. And after that time is expired, the bottom curtain shutter comes up, the second curtain shutter, to finish the exposure, and then it opens back up and puts you back in the live view. And that's the single frame mechanical shutter operation. Internally, that's what the camera's doing. And this will make more sense why I'm showing you this in a moment, okay? Because watch this time, okay, closely, when the first front curtain shutter comes down. See how it comes down and it bounces a little bit, right? When it came down before going back up. And this is causing a little bit of vibration in the camera. And that's why Olympus came up with the anti-shock shutter, okay? And it works pretty much the same with a very, very slight difference, okay? So let's talk about the anti-shock shutter. The only difference is, okay, here we are in live view, the sensor's exposed, you can compose your picture, then you go to take it, you push the shutter button, the sensor turns off, the shutter comes down, okay, it bounces a little, then it goes back up, but it doesn't turn the sensor back on yet. After the shutter opens all the way up, there's a slight delay, some fraction of a second, before it turns the sensor on. And that delay is normally enough time to let any vibrations in the camera subside. So it turns the sensor on after that for 1/80th of a second or whatever the shutter speed is, and then the bottom shutter closes to finish the exposure, opens back up, and then you're back in live view. So anti-shock is almost identical to the regular mechanical shutter, except for it doesn't turn the sensor on until the shutter is opened all the way up, and waits for a slight delay, and you can control that delay. By default, it's some fraction of a second. They don't tell you, but it's just long enough to reduce any kind of shake internal to the camera. And then after an 1/80th of a second or whatever the shutter speed is, the bottom shutter closes. So for anti-shock, it's really useful for like You know, for normal photography, it's not a big deal. You know, that's why I haven't really talked about it yet. You know, you're just out taking pictures, you're not going to notice any kind of internal shake. But if you're doing very deliberate photography, like macro photography, or you're doing extreme telephotos, you're at 300 millimeters or equivalent 600 millimeters, this little bit of delay is a big difference, and it'll show up in your pictures, particularly in macro and telephoto. You'll see a little bit of a shake if you're not using anti-shock, if you pixel peep into the camera. And setting this delay also in anti-shock, and you can set that delay yourself manually to a half a second, 1 second, up to 30 seconds in the menus. And I'll show you that after I go through this demo. So that after the shutter opens, it doesn't turn the camera on or the sensor on for a predetermined amount of time that you can set up to 30 seconds. And that's more useful for like very long telephoto lenses where everything's kind of moving for a long time after you hit the shutter button. And you'll notice this when you're trying to do like shots of the moon. You know, the slightest movement just shows up, especially at extreme telephotos. I had a 1200 millimeter equivalent lens on my Pen F one night doing moon shots, and I tell you, I had to wait really a good 15 to 20 seconds before everything stopped moving. So this anti-shock is a very handy feature for those types of photography. Okay, and then finally there is the electronic shutter, which eliminates any shutter movement at all. All it does simply is you have the sensor open here. All it does is turn the sensor on and off up to 1/60th of a second or 1/16,000th of a second. So you can achieve very, very fast shutter speeds in terms of exposure using an electronic shutter. And the electronic shutter has, you know, the other advantage of being completely silent. So you're not you know, distracting during events like weddings in a church or whatever, or, you know, maybe you're taking pictures of nature and you don't want to scare off whatever you're getting a picture of by shutter sound or shutter clack. So the fully electronic shutter, you know, is really good also for like macro work where you're very close of like flowers, still subjects. You eliminate any kind of camera shake at all. So that's really good. Now, with all those advantages, though, there's some very significant disadvantages to the electronic shutter, namely the rolling shutter effect, okay, and banding can also be a problem. So what is rolling shutter? Okay, rolling shutter is basically for things that are moving, you know, in front of the camera. So if you have a car driving by very quickly in front of you and you want to get a picture, you might notice that the car is a little bit distorted, you know, one way or the other. Or let's say you're panning, okay, and following the car, then the car might be fine, but then the buildings and poles and everything behind it will be kind of slanted. And, you know, I just did a quick picture down here to demonstrate that of my wall. This is one using a mechanical shutter, and then this is one using the electronic shutter, and you can see that the wall is, you know, slanted back or forth. And that's a problem with using fully electronic shutters, and it's something that you see a lot of people that when they test cameras, they test for that, okay, because it, you know, it's very difficult to fix those kind of problems in Photoshop, okay. Another significant problem with electronic shutter is banding, okay, and banding is caused by the frequency of the lights turning on and off. Now, to the naked eye, you know, everything looks fine, you know, we don't see that flickering, but when you're dealing with an electronic shutter that's operating a certain shutter rate, and I'll talk about that in a minute, it's going to take the picture at different times, and it might be at a time when the lights are slightly dim or off. So that's where banding occurs, okay? And this is an example of that. There's lots of examples. You may have already run into it yourself. It's particularly bad with fluorescent lighting, the banding issue. So that's something to be kind of aware of. Now, if your shutter speed's below 1/20th of a second, banding shouldn't be an issue. And there's other tips and tricks to eliminate banding. Even with mechanical shutters, you can get banding. So we'll talk about that in some other modules, but just understand some of the limitations of electronic shutter along with some of the advantages, right? Okay, now Um, I talked about shutter rate versus shutter speed. These are two very distinctly different things, okay? Now, the shutter rate is how quickly can the shutter open and close versus the shutter speed, which is the exposure, okay? And this is the difference, okay? And I'll illustrate first with the electronic shutter, okay? Now with the electronic shutter, what's happening is, let's say this is our sensor. What it does is it reads the first line, okay, the first row of pixels, however many rows that is, for the exposure. So it'll turn the sensor on and off at whatever shutter speed we set it at. Let's say 1/16,000th of a second. It'll turn that row of pixels on for 1/16,000th of a second, then turn them back off, and then it'll read that data into the buffer or memory card. And then it goes to the next row of pixels and reads that line. Okay, so the next row of pixels turns on for 1/16,000th of a second, then turns back off, and then it reads that. And then it does that for X number of times until it gets to the end of the sensor at the bottom and writes all of that to the memory card. Okay, so the problem is the read speed from top to bottom is the shutter rate. Okay, the individual rows, okay, is the shutter speed. There, meaning, you know, how fast does it turn that row of pixels on and off? 1/16,000th of a second, 1/8 of a second, whatever that is. That's the shutter speed, so your exposure will be correct, but the shutter rate is the actual read speed of reading from top to bottom. Okay, and that's why you get the rolling shutter, because this rate coming down is very slow compared to the actual shutter speed of the individual row. So what will happen is you'll start here, and your subject will be, say, you know, let's say your subject is here, and then as it's reading down, the subject has moved a little bit until you get to the bottom. So that's why you kind of get that tilting effect or distortion. And that read speed is, you know, different cameras have different read speeds, you know, apparently, or, you know, hopefully more expensive cameras have faster read rates. Like the E-M10 Mark II is amazing, right? Even electronic shutter, you get pretty minimal rolling shutter, okay, relative to other cameras. It's still there. And even a mechanical shutter, you can still get rolling shutter, okay, but it's minimized to a great extent, because what's happening is when the shutter opens up and the sensor is exposed, the bottom shutter comes up, but the sensor's still on. Okay, the bottom shutter comes up, and then it has all the time in the world to read, you know, all of the data that the sensor captured. So the read speed is irrelevant. What our shutter rate now is how quickly can this bottom shutter come up and end the exposure. And that shutter rate is approximately 1/320th of a second. Okay, and it's just a guess on my part, but I'll give you my logic to why I think that's the approximate shutter rate, okay? Because the reason I say that is because if you look in the manual, the anti-shock mode, okay, doesn't work over 1/320th of a second, okay? So that tells me that the longest or the quickest it can have the sensor fully exposed, fully open like this, is 1/320th of a second. The shutter cannot close any faster than that. And hence that's why the anti-shock doesn't work any faster than that. Because what happens when you get over 1/320th of a second, the mechanical shutter operates a little bit differently. Okay, and I'll explain that. Hopefully you can see that in this demo here. But what's happening is the same thing in the mechanical shutter. You know, the top front curtain shutter comes down, okay, and then it raises back up with the shutter on or, you know, on or off, depending if you're an anti-shock or not. But when it's coming up, you'll notice that the bottom shutter is coming up with it, okay? So watch that closely. Hopefully you can see that. The shutter comes down, the front curtain shutter, then the second shutter comes up together with it like this, okay? So that's how in mechanical shutter you can achieve shutter speeds faster than 1/320th of a second. On the E-M10 Mark II, you can get up to 1/4000th of a second. On the E-M1 Mark II, you can get up to 1/8000th of a second. So it's cheating. It's not really a 1/4000th of a second speed. It's really still at 1/320th of a second, but it's only exposing the sensor a little bit at a time as the two shutters are moving up. So the faster the shutter speed, the smaller that little slit in between the two shutter planes is going to be, thereby effectively giving you 1/4000th of a second at its highest setting. So that's basically how the mechanical shutter works, okay? And one of the advantages of mechanical shutter, besides not having that rolling shutter effect, is very much reduced at this point. Is, you can also start syncing your flashes with it, so that, that's when you kind of get into, or maybe you've heard about already, flash sync speeds. And the Olympus E-M10 Mark II, the flash sync speed is 1/250th of a second. And that's why you cannot use flash with the silent shutter, because of that read speed, okay? So the flash is completely disabled, or the shutter rate, the flash is completely disabled in silent mode. And it's limited in mechanical shutter up to 1/250th of a second, with the exception of high-speed sync flashes, which will be able to work at much higher speeds, up to 1/4000th of a second in this camera. And the reason it can do that is, the normal flash sync speed of 1/250th of a second, the flash can fire while the sensor is completely open and exposed, thereby illuminating everything. But when you're in a faster speed or high speed, remember, you only have that little slit going up. So what the flash has to do is fire repeatedly, okay, for each part of that slit covering the sensor. But sorry, I didn't mean to go that far with that, but I couldn't help myself. That's kind of where that was going. And we'll talk about high-speed sync, off-camera flash, flash sync, and everything in another module. Thanks again for watching, and again, I appreciate all the great feedback you guys have been giving me, and I have been getting your emails through my website for different requests for different types of tutorials, so I will work on those, I promise you. And in the next part, I think I'm going to start to get into exposure and taking the camera out of the aperture priority that we've been working in all up to this time. So hit subscribe if you'd like to see more, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.